Hey everyone, welcome back to the Finance Things in Life. I'm Matt, along with my brother Anthony. We're from the Pitti Group Wealth Management. And today we have a special guest, Peter Glennon from the Glennon Law Firm PC. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you for having me, both of you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so before we kind of kick things off, and today we're going to be talking about family business and possible problems of, being a solo owner to then, graduating to more employees and family and divorce and all those other
all
good
those
things.
crazy things that come with being a business owner.
Yeah, right. Why don't we kind of give an introduction of who you are and kind of what you specialize in.
Sure. Well, again, thanks for having me. I lead the Glennon Law Firm PC. We're a statewide litigation firm. We have offices in Rochester, Buffalo, Albany, and New York City, and we focus on kind of this niche clientele, which tends to be what I call PBOs, professionals, executives, and business owners, licensed professionals like doctors, dentists, financial securities people, executives, C-suite folks, and then, of course, small business owners, whether family owned or closely held businesses. And we only do litigation, so it's really interesting. We come in and fix problems that arise that we see in these practices, whether they're professional service practices or other manufacturing businesses or any type of business. And we see it, we always say that we do the professional side of business litigation and employment litigation, but then there's also the private matters, which include the trust and estates litigation, as well as matrimonial issues like prenuptial agreements, postnuptial agreements, and of course divorces for business owners, people who have assets. So we tend to have this unique focus on litigating complex financial assets and seeing the problems, whether they're professional or private, for those business owners.
A lot going on there.
Yeah, that's a lot to take on.
Yeah, and and some of it, strikes a chord with us being a family business and kind of some of those life changes that happen with people. So yeah. Excited to kind of dive into it and kind of get your intake. So,
yeah.
So really naturally, solo business owner, probably the simplest out of all of them, right?
Starting off, yeah.
We'd start
Starting
there.
off a business, you hire yourself, and
you're working for yourself. Hope to pay yourself, right?
Hopefully, that'd be ideal, an ideal scenario.
So yeah, and then as you're growing, you hopefully. Then you start bringing on employees. So kind of what's the things to kind of keep in mind as a solo business owner?
Right. So this is, Matt, what we refer to kind of as the baseline problems for any business owner, right? They have their state regulations, county regulations that they need to comply with, and they need to speak with a CPA and or a business attorney to make sure that they're organized properly. Of course, there's the solo entrepreneur, if you will, but then there's the entities of LLCs and partnerships, corporations. So the solo owner needs to figure out what's the best formation and an entity type for him or herself and get that advice from appropriate advisors. But once you get started with that, and when you add the employees, well, now you have other regulations you have to follow. And of course, we all know about discrimination and retaliation laws, but there's also payroll laws and regulations and different recording requirements there. And then, of course, you're a business, so you have to deal with other businesses. There's other vendors, there's maybe a supplier for you, and then you always have customers, hopefully. So when you have all of those situations, now you're talking about contracts, you're talking about advertising rules and regulations, and then, of course, you just have customer service requirements. So I always view those as baseline problems, right? It's nice to think you know how to do the job and you start your business. But what I see is a lot of successful businesses start off just doing what they do best, whether that's selling or manufacturing or solving a problem for somebody out there. And then it's usually when they get farther along in the business, they realize, hey, I never set up that entity. So I don't have protection from my personal assets, right? They're making money, they're investing money, they're making retirement plans, hopefully, they're saving for college education for their children. But if they don't have one of those entity formations, well, now it's just them as an individual who could be liable or responsible to any legal issue, whether it's from a business dispute or an employment dispute.
Yeah.
Is there a specific way of setting up that entity or a certain one that you want to look for as far as getting those protections?
Sure, and that's where, again, I'm a litigator. So we come in and fix problems. There's the transactional attorneys who help guide these people starting off with their new businesses with what type of form they should take.
Yep.
And it really, a lot of people have gone to some of these online platforms and they just pay $299 to get an LLC. Great, keeps me in business because that's usually where all the problems are. If you're just
Keep doing that if you learned anything today.
Please. But if you go to a business attorney, he or she is going to explain liability protections and talk about what's your plan. Do you want to stay this way? Is this just a niche type of, culture life type of business? Or do you plan to grow and scale? And you can always change your entities, but there's different considerations with each option. There's also tax considerations, which I know you guys can't give advice on, I can't give advice on, but that's where CPAs come in. And there's different ways you can structure these your tax position based on your business organization.
Yeah, I think we stress a lot, that, whether you're a business owner or just a normal person or you're employed, that, you have your advisor, you have your CPA, and having those people talk and communicate. But it's also, as far as a business owner, important to have your attorney or whoever is representing that part of this business also speaking with your CPA and advisor and having them work together as a team.
Yeah, exactly. It's a team. It doesn't make any sense, if you want to put it into a sports analogy, to have all these different positions on your team and none of them talk to each other. They're all going to end up working together. They can't run the same play if no one knows what that play is. So it's really important to have those sides communicate, because those areas, they do blend together quite a bit.
Yeah. So, if you have, a solo business owner, obviously if when that person passes away, they're probably going to have their business either sold or go to their estate or dissolve, right? I mean, but what happens if now you're starting to add to that your team? So now, instead of being a solo business owner, you have promoted someone to a partner, or maybe you have a family member come on board. What does that look like?
Right. So that goes back to, you still have those baseline challenges, whether it's the regulation, the employees, customers, production. But now you have somebody else who is entitled to some profits, who's entitled to some decision making, perhaps, if you make them a partner or part owner or give them any equity stake. And that's where we see most of these problems come up, especially for folks who form their entity online without consulting with an attorney first, because they're not updating their documents, right? And it's those governing documents, whether it's a partnership agreement or an operating agreement for an LLC or a shareholders agreement for a corporation. It's those governing documents that can dictate who makes decisions for what area within the business, and how will we divide expenses and calculate these profits. And it lays out the roadmap, the rules for everybody to follow. And then, similar as you touched on too, Matt, the future, the succession plan. So for the business, you have governing documents and rules effectively of how you're going to operate and manage the business. But now if you're also starting a family and you want to make sure that something, whether it's your retirement plan, whether it's your private investments, or it's your ownership interest in an entity, should something happen to you accidentally, and you're gone before you plan to be, now who gets to own your interest share? I'll tell you, there's a big challenge out there with LLCs, for example, which is a very, very popular and very common entity. If it doesn't talk about your interest in there, now it ends up in probate court, and if it's not addressed in your will. And sometimes, and I've seen this sadly in closely held businesses, the leader of the business, who's the majority owner of the LLC, who's really the power behind the business, passes away, but the poorly drafted governing documents left his wife with nothing but what we call an economic interest. She had no control over the business. She couldn't decide how things could function. It was just the two remaining owners. would decide how the business goes, and she'd only receive some of the profits.
Hmm.
But that's because as that business was growing, they didn't go and have their documents reviewed by another attorney. They weren't communicating. They weren't discussing this with their trust and estate attorney who would draft their will for them. So that's just one example of what we need to think about. As you're adding a partner, you've got the private side with your estate planning, and then you also have the how are we going to work together, you and me. And that can arise with what we call business divorces. If you have these problems, if you and I become partners, and we're not on the same page with who's responsible for what, now we start to have arguments, and now we want to push each other out of the business.
Right.
So communication again.
Yeah. Oh, communication's, probably really key there. And then, I'm just thinking, my situation now with, obviously family business, with, it's an LLC where we have ownership. Obviously my kids are younger. They're 12 and 15 almost. So right now, they would essentially inherit my portion of the business, but do I have them inherit the financial side of it? Is there a way to leave the door open for them to possibly come in, eventually be part of the business? Those are all things that I haven't really thought about.
Another challenge with that too is sometimes with your children, especially at that age, the governing document would talk about maybe there's a guaranteed buyout, right? If something happens to Matt, well, his kids are too young for this, so let's just value his interest in the LLC and the company will buy it out for him. Challenge there again, not reviewing this document. Sometimes people set it, it's 2025. They set today's valuation for it. And now something happened to you in 2035 and nobody's changed that valuation.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Now your children just lost it.
right. Or gained, who knows?
Or gained.
Yeah, right.
Not gained.
Right. Well, I mean, I'm sure there's businesses out there where they valued it at a certain point. Maybe it's not valued as much. I mean, what would legally happen there? I mean, they have to buy them out at the higher price?
That can be the result.
Yeah, see, that's wild.
Not necessarily the higher price. The better way to do it is to set up a formula in the document and talk about having a neutral third-party business valuation performed and then make that work. But unfortunately, with a lot of these stock agreements that people get, they just $10 a point or $10 a share, or it's based on the revenue of this year times 3. But now maybe business takes off because Anthony gets out there and he's making it rain.
Pushing it.
Yeah, make it rain. Make it rain for my kids. Any other kind of, things to think about as you're adding more, family or partners to the mix as far as, I don't know, accounting or, shares or distributions or sharing those profits that we need to keep in consideration?
Sure. Well, and that goes back to the governing documents and the taxability. So consulting with your advisors again, as you mentioned. But what we also start to see is in the employment law phase of this is if you bring on a partner, whether it's a family member or just a close friend, you're probably growing and you need to hire more employees. Where you're going to hire now? More of your family? More of your new partner's family? That adds a new dynamic. Are you going to bring in non-family members? And then how are you going to manage that culture where if it's a non-family member, whose side are they going to take? Which goes back to you need to communicate and keep the culture professional. There's an old saying I joke about with small businesses and medium-sized businesses, all businesses. So many people like to talk about this great culture where we're all family. Well, the challenge with that is with family, we make excuses, right? Well, that's not having a good day, or it's been a bad week. Well, if we weren't related, I'd hold you to that standard, I hope. I'd hold you to that KPI. But now when you do have a closely held business and your employees are part of your family, you really can't say that we're not going to treat them as family. So you have this new dynamic that you need to consider for your culture.
Right.
Yeah, you don't really think about that.
No, you don't.
A lot of those soft skills that you don't really think about either, the communication side. I think that's a big part of it. Just having those conversations, as uncomfortable as they may be, about what needs to happen and why it needs to happen, can really avoid those hurdles later on.
Yeah, for sure. You're going through your business life, and you're adding employees or partners. There's different life events that come into play. So marriage, divorce. How do some of those things affect a business, as far as a business owner perspective?
Yeah, and that kind of goes back to how are we treating people as family with excuses or not. But what we know is, as mom or dad starts this business and they bring in the children, sometimes there's some romantic relationships that occur between employees, whether you're family or not. And there's employment considerations for that, to how to handle that from an HR perspective. Well, when it's family now, how are you going to handle this to make sure that any personal issue doesn't cause a business problem during the day? And if any business challenges are being faced, how does that affect your Thanksgiving dinner when everybody's together?
Right.
So it goes
Not
back
passing the mashed potatoes,
Right.
that's for sure.
It can be challenging, and we see that a lot. And I mention these not because it's just, this happens all the time. Yes, it happens all the time, but these are the seeds of what really, when these start, this is what grows and develops and evolves into the greater problem of management of the business, and which could lead to the business dispute, internal partnership dispute, or employment, because you can still have a family member allege harassment, discrimination, retaliation against the company. Hopefully the business has EPLI, which is insurance for employment practices. But in any event, it goes back to the communication. And now as you have these family members coming in, again, clear roles and responsibilities, and who's going to make what decisions. And it's never good to have any romantic relationship where one person is the supervisor of the other. It's never a good setting with family or without family. But
Yeah, I think the take from every point so far is communication is key.
Yeah, yeah. If we were to call this episode anything, I think communication is key would be the primary title.
We've talked about like partners and families and hiring, promotions, titles. I think that all probably comes into play as far as making sure that everyone's treated fairly, I guess is the best way to put that, right? Yeah. What about succession planning? Right now with our business, my dad and I are the two partners. My brother joined us 8 years ago. So I've been working with my dad almost 20 years. But I'm sure at some point, making my brother a partner, or the succession planning as my dad possibly gets out of the business. But in other businesses, how does that work, or what's the best way to approach that?
it is a challenge for any business, but especially when you add family and different generations of family, because you have different phases in life, right? Whether you're just starting off and you have young children or older children, you're planning to go to college, because that starts to impact the profitability, right? And now you start having arguments about who's contributing more, and who deserves more of a share of the profit. So going back to your comment, it's communicating, but then documenting all of these things. And I think that's what's very important, is somebody still needs to be in charge. Somebody has to have the final vote. So we could communicate about how this is going to operate, the succession planning, the buy-in, because we're still talking about a business, right?
Right.
This is wealth, this is assets. So what I usually see is, if you're a functional family, which is rare, right? Because we're all families. but if you can talk about these things, it's great. Other times there are consultants that companies could bring in and say, just walk me through the process, and let's try to keep the personal feelings out of it. Again, whether it's family or a non-family business, everybody with a seat at the table has a different interest. And what's best is, in my opinion, is to always focus on what's best for the company. and then figure out what's the fairness, to your word before,
Yeah.
in handling this. But it goes back to a lot of people start businesses with the idea of just wanting to be on their own or to pay their mortgage. But what's your next step? And it can go back to vision, right? What is the future of this business? Do we want to grow and scale it? Do we want it to be family? Do we want it to be every member of the family? Because I have seen some other family businesses where they said, you know, there's 3 children, but only one of you really cares so much about
Yep.
it. So we're not excluding the other 2, but there'll be either buyouts or employment agreements.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And, but you have to have a sober, mature discussion of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, just from my personal experience, I know a number of different family businesses that'll actually set up retreats for their family. So they will go a hotel, they'll rent out a conference room or whatever it is, get a house, and they'll go away for the weekend and just talk business. And they sit around a table and they talk about the future of the business, if they want to be part of the business, what their plans are. And then as you get older, let's say you've had kids, once you get to a certain age, they start to be incorporated in some of those business meetings. So then everyone has that communication. Those kids are kind of brought up with those discussions in mind. Kind of tying back to the whole communication and clarity side, it's just a better way of kind of nipping these potential future hazards in the butt now instead of letting those things build up and having to deal with them later.
Yeah, and like you said before, I mean, I think everyone is at a different spot in their life, you know, as far as if you're the original business owner, maybe your children are in the business now, you know, you're probably maybe have a little more free time. Maybe you want to take a step back, or maybe you have time to kind of focus on growth. If your kids are in the business and they have their own families, maybe they're preoccupied. They can't focus on growth as much. So they're not necessarily not wanting to participate in the growth of the business, but, you know, they're growing their own family and have other responsibilities. Or if you had someone that was, you know, part of they're, you know, single, you know, and they have all the time in the world, maybe they're just out of college and they're growth oriented and kind of driving things. So I can see how that dynamic kind of plays a role. But
Yeah, everyone's going to have their own priorities.
Right.
I mean, you know, some people, their family's a priority. Some people, their freedom's a priority. Some people, the business is a priority. It all kind of depends. But having those conversations of kind of what's going to be, you know, what's going to be key to move this business forward. How can we kind of take a little bit of each side and make it work for everyone? But again, everything's going to tie back to that communication piece.
Right. Yeah.
Well, and the other challenge on the communication with generations, I mean, Dad, if he started the business, he may do very well and have a nice vehicle and a nice house and a whole bunch of nice vacations. And now the 2 children who come and follow, and they think, hey, I can have this lifestyle too. And they probably can as the business is growing. But now if those 2 children have 2 to 4 children of their own, you bring them in, that's where the dilution of the equity is there, unless you're still growing the business.
Right.
And that could be the family focus. How are we going to keep growing this so that it can sustain generations to come?
Yeah,
For sure.
Yeah. Now, as far as, you know, succession planning, you know, because I think another big thing is when you have an individual that started a business and they've been doing it for 30, 40 years. I mean, it's their baby, right? And then you have partners, whether family members or not family members, that now want to kind of have their piece of that business and kind of maybe have their own vision of growth. And I feel like, and I've seen where that dynamic kind of starts to maybe, you know, people aren't seeing eye to eye. And so it's, any thoughts there as far as ways to handle that?
You know, it can be challenging. And the best part is if you've been refining and updating your governing documents this whole time, you can always fall back to those rules, right? If one partner wants to go in one direction, but it doesn't align with the rules, you have a nice stop right there. I'm sorry, that's a great idea, but our business doesn't allow for that, or I get to make the decision, and we're not doing that. If you haven't continuously updated your documents and you haven't kept communicating, it really does come back to, it's a relationship. Everything we do is a relationship, right? Whether it's personal, whether it's professional, if we're business partners, there's a relationship there. How are we going to trust and respect each other and communicate about all these points? But I do see times there are mediators who can come in and help. There are consultants and coaches, but there's also best practices. And I think you guys are involved with a lot of groups too out there. When you associate with other business owners, that's a great resource for you to go out and say, how do you guys handle this? And it's because if you and I are having a challenge, we're looking out for our own individual interests. Maybe we're saying it's for the business, but we're looking at it from our perspective. But when you can get that outside feedback, again, from any of your members of the board of advisors or other professionals, they see things from a different angle. And maybe that can help facilitate a discussion to reach where you need to get to.
Yeah.
But that's where I see, as you're growing with all of these other people who want a piece of the pie, who are getting involved, and they either want control or they want profit or they want both. And everybody needs to be treated with respect. I think, Anthony, you talked about sports team analogy before. You all have to be on the same team to do this.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, somebody's going to be calling somebody like me,
Right.
saying,
Right.
and now there's cost and expense there.
Yeah.
And I'm amazed too when you have the successive generations fighting over an employment contract. You're all family. You all came from the same background, and now you're arguing over the term of a contract and the amount of a bonus for an employee position. I've seen too many families fight about that too. But it goes back to, let's have a plan and let's execute it.
Right.
The challenging thing is when there's something you haven't planned for, whether it's the succession or someone passes away sooner, or if you haven't updated your will or your trust or estate. Because a lot of people put assets into these trusts or into other LLC entities, but then they don't talk about it with the family.
Right.
Or maybe they say, hey, Matt, I'm going to give you my shares or 30% of my share, but then I say the same thing to you, Anthony. But that's not exactly what my document says. So
Right.
there has to be a level of honesty.
Yeah, I think that's probably knowing what everyone's plan is, and especially when it comes to their trust or estates and wills, especially for the partners of a company. I think that's probably really important.
Well, it's not only just for the business side, but it's for the personal side as well. Like if we're not having a conversation about what a trust may say or what a will may say or what the succession plan is, it's very hard for that individual to plan for their future as well. So it's even having that conversation just so that person can be prepared and start making some plans for what they're trying to do.
And it's always challenging when the marriages start, and you bring outsiders into the family.
Right.
And because that comes up in two ways, because now you have, the marital side, whether it's prenuptial agreements or divorces, and then even on the trust and estate side, God forbid something happens to the owner's son or daughter, and it's the in-law, the daughter or son-in-law who now wants a seat at the table. These are touchy situations, but if you can plan for them ahead of time, and that's, again, communication. But let's go back to choosing the right spouse. I guess if everybody can figure out how to do that. Because that's the one other issue I see arise often that can become a seed for a big problem with the business, is if somebody comes in and they're looking at a prenuptial agreement or they're getting divorced, the value of that business, that is open game now to this new person. And now that could affect the entire family business and how it's being valued at that time. I always encourage people before they get married, when they have some ownership interest in a business, to think long and hard about a prenuptial agreement, because that can take care of a lot of those issues that can arise down the road.
Mm-hmm.
Thankfully, divorce rates are going down, but I don't think their marriage rates are increasing, but I don't know. But
Yeah, thankfully for that. Yeah, and I mean, I think that gets back to the point as well as, we'll keep looping back to the communication, but even if you don't have shares in a business, but you may have future shares in a business, let's say, you're a family member that's joining a business that may have potential partnership in that company, having that conversation. So if they are getting married, say, hey, this is something you may want to think about as far as a potential, prenup or a postnup at that point. Just so you're aware of the situation, you're not kind of stuck after divorce, then dealing with it.
Yeah. Oh yeah, because I'm sure. I mean, it can change the dynamic, of a company. Especially a divorce. And look at that, and having to do a business valuation and kind of that side of things. So.
I mean, try just being married, and then you're a partner of a company, and you're like, by the way, you just signed this prenuptial agreement.
Yeah. Or even as a
business
owner, because I mean that. So let's say you're a solo business owner, you're married, and now essentially your ex-spouse would be entitled to half of your business if you don't have a prenup or a postnup, correct? So then what would happen is you'd have to buy them out.
So here's a secret: start your business before you get married, and then keep your business separate from your marital assets. If you do that, and then you later marry, and now you're getting divorced, there's no argument for 50% of that business. There might be an argument for 5 or 10% of the value of that business if there were some direct or indirect contributions that your spouse made to allow you the time to go work and develop this business. But that's something I see a lot of people do. They go out and they do the sweat equity and they build this business and they hustle, and then they get married, and I respect this. They want everything just to be the family now, and they don't keep that business separate. In a divorce, without a prenup or postnup, if they don't keep it separate, then you're right. Now there's an argument about a large portion of that business valuation that could go to the spouse. Not necessarily 50%. It doesn't have to be 50%. I know a lot of people who are the non-business owners demand that it be 50%. But if you're a professional, licensed professional, whether architect, engineer, doctor, dentist, and your spouse is not, there's no way they can get 50% because they're just not licensed for it. And if your divorcing spouse has his or her own career that they've been focused on the whole time, there's going to be very little. I think case law is usually around 10 to 12% of that valuation. But there's arguments. It's much like non-compete agreements. It's never black and white when it comes to divorce with business owners. It comes back to contribution and when you started it, how you financed it, and or trace the money.
Yeah, a lot to think about. Especially, everyone, not everyone, but a lot of people out there want to be, a business owner. They want to be self-employed. They want to work for themselves. They don't want to work for somebody else. But there's a lot more that apparently goes into it than just that.
Significant,
so, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I always think back to when I was a young professional and all these various young professional groups that are out there. I always think they need a young professional package, right? It's something that explains to them some handouts on employment agreements, on retirement savings, right? On college savings. It's never too early, even if you don't have kids, to start saving for that. Personal financial management, but then also on prenuptial agreements. They're not so unromantic today.
Right, yeah.
And what to do, the rules of the road. That's all the law is.
Right.
The law is just a rule handbook. But I always tell young professionals, I'm in business because people don't think about it till it's done. But in fact, I kind of joke sometimes with folks like yourselves in your wealth management business. You're in kind of the front of the parade of life, right? Everybody's excited. We're making money. We're saving money. These guys are going to get us to the promised land. I'm in the back of the parade with a push broom, cleaning up the confetti and everything.
That's great.
Right.
The more they know, ahead of time, and that's where a lot of people touch wealth managers and accountants before they ever touch any lawyers or other consultants.
Yeah.
But like you're saying, board of advisors, having you guys who are so involved with family business, closely held businesses and professionals, knowing that you guys have this broader perspective, that could be helpful to business owners, giving tips ahead of time.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the one thing we can pull from this is communication, just being open with whoever, is part of the company, and keeping your documents up to date, having all your advisors working together, whether it's your attorney, CPA, financial advisor. That's going to be critical. So I think
There's always going to be problems when you're a business owner, and it's just how you can address them. But yeah, I'd say the 3 things to remember is to document and then review and update those documents, but communicate about them all the time, whether they're your business ones or your private family estate planning. And don't be afraid to talk about these issues now while you're all getting along.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, seriously, that can turn real quick. Especially, money changes people, that's for sure. Especially when you're not talking about it. So having those issues arise can definitely flare up some tension. And it's best to have those conversations when tensions are low than when they're much, much higher.
Well, and I think that communication probably will mitigate that tension, because people always think, like you said before, people have their viewpoint and it's in their best interest. And obviously everyone in a family business, everyone wants what's best for the company, but they also are from their viewpoint.
For sure, for sure. And that's when chances or opportunities like bringing in a mediator or a third party to have those conversations can really help, because maybe they're looking at it from a completely different standpoint. They're looking at it from an area of a more holistic view, not so much from where you're looking or where person A and person B are looking. So that can really create some light to more of a gray area.
Yeah. So when are we scheduling our family retreat?
As long as it's somewhere warm, we can do it whenever you want.
Perfect. Anything else that you can
some highlights?
Yeah.
I think the greatest thing for people to remember is it's all about relationships, and not just to remain focused on that one goal of sales. You have all of these facets of your business in your life that you need to consider. And there's a lot of problems that could arise, but if you nip them in the bud early on with communication, you'll generally be all right. But none of it's perfect for anybody.
Right.
That's why people like I exist.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But thanks.
Yeah. Well,
Anytime.
Thank you. Yeah. No, we appreciate you coming on and sharing all this, really important and, insightful things. So
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions for Peter, please feel free to reach out to him. If you want to reach out to us, we'd be happy to pass along his information. But he's a great resource to have if you are having some of those issues that we talked about today.
Yeah. Perfect. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.